June 4, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 325 miles northwest of Midway. On the bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu, an eerie silence precedes the crash. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi adjusts the binoculars and paralyzes. Down below, cutting through the sky with his air group, is something that Imperial intelligence had declared dead. The raised frame, the tilted mast, the deck configuration. It was unmistakable. The USS Yorktown, the same ship that the Japanese had riddled with bombs in the Coral Sea. The same one that, according to all reports, could not be there. This image was more than a miscalculation. It was the collapse of a certainty cultivated by Japanese generals and engineers, based on naval doctrine, shipyard schedules, and absolute faith in the slowness of the enemy. This is the account of how the United States broke this logic with welding, urgency, and an industrial philosophy that transformed wreckage into fighting power. In this video, we will see how 1,400 civilian workers accomplished, in 72 hours, what Imperial strategists would have taken 3 months to believe. Because on that day, the Japanese didn't just spot one ship. They saw proof that they were fighting against something their doctrine never foresaw: the functional speed of American industrial democracy. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any explosion or battle map. The time estimated by the Japanese for the USS Yorktown to return to sea was 90 days. The actual time was 72 hours, a difference of almost 3,000%. For the Imperial Navy, it was a logistical impossibility, a technical absurdity, and for this reason, it was ignored. On the day of the Battle of Midway, they were expecting 2 American carriers. They found 3. And this third presence, thought dead, was the shrapnel that broke not only his calculations but all confidence in the Japanese naval domain. If you value the story told with accuracy, respect, and depth, please consider supporting this work with your application and a like. This helps us keep alive the memory of the details that changed the course of the war. May 8, 1942. In the gray sky of the Coral Sea, 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers from the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku break through the clouds and line up for the dive. Ahead, emerging from the fog like an injured animal, the USS Yorktown tries to accelerate. The bomb hits the deck with millimeter precision. 250 kilograms of steel and explosive penetrate 5 levels of the structure until it explodes inside the machinery compartments. The impact shakes the hoof like a punch straight to a boxer's stomach. The smoke rises as a sign of victory, and the Japanese pilots return to the fleet with a clear message: target eliminated. The ship seems doomed, tilted, slow, covered in oil slicks, and with fires visible on the side. The Yorktown is photographed being rescued by destroyers. The reports sent to Tokyo are categorical: sunk. By the standards of Japanese naval doctrine, the damage is irrecoverable in the short term. It would take the Kure or Sasebo shipyards at least 90 days to make a ship in these conditions operational again, if it was not dismantled for reuse. In Japanese logic, honor and method impose themselves on urgency. The engineering must be perfect. The hull needs to be redone according to the original plans. Repairing quickly is considered risky. Improvising is almost shameful. Admiral Takagi signs the final report: USS Yorktown eliminated from the war. But on the American side, the logic is different. The ship that limped at 6 knots, according to enemy observers, actually accelerated at 20. And while cutting 3,300 miles to Pearl Harbor, the first repairs were already beginning on board. Plates welded in the sea itself, cables rearranged, realigned hydraulic systems with parts repurposed from makeshift workshops. Nothing was pretty, but everything worked. Captain Elliot Buckmaster did not ask permission from manuals. He asked for results. This difference in mentality would define the course of the war. While the Imperial Navy operated based on theoretical models, the United States Navy operated based on function. What works, serves. What serves, fights. Here, a statistic ignored by Japanese planners helps explain the strategic error. In 1942, American shipyards were already operating with the capacity to produce 1 new merchant ship every 4.5 days, a cadence that Germany and Japan could not even imagine. In the same year, the United States installed more than 8,000 industrial cranes, tripling its port handling capacity in less than 12 months. A difference in scale so abysmal that, for many Japanese analysts, It seemed like fiction. If this reality surprises you, write in the comments, logistics wins. Because the war, before being decided at sea, was won on industrial maps. What the Japanese called destruction, the Americans called a technical challenge. As Takagi and Nagumo removed the Yorktown from the calculation of Operation MI, the ship was quietly approaching Pearl Harbor. Waiting for him, Rear Admiral Nimitz was preparing something that would redefine the concept of naval repair. Because if the Japanese were right in their shipyard math, they were blind to the American spirit that turned urgency into method. Yorktown was not defeated. He was just beginning his real mission. And on May 27, 1942, when it finally docked at Pearl Harbor, staining the water with oil and smoke, a new battle began, not against Japan, but against time. In the next few minutes, we will see how 400 civilian workers tried to do in 3 days what Japan thought impossible in 3 months. South of Japan at the Kure Naval Base, Imperial Navy planners updated their cadres with almost mathematical precision. Yorktown was scratched. The source was reliable. Veteran pilots, reconnaissance photographs, radio intercepts. Nothing in his analysis indicated that that carrier could be operational in the coming weeks. Japanese doctrine, shaped by rigid technical traditions and an inflexible code of conduct, did not admit of any other scenario. For the naval engineers of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the structural damage suffered in the Coral Sea was terminal, or at the very least, would require a long and respectful sequence of repairs, dismantling, replacement, rigorous inspections, and extensive testing. This was the practice in peacetime, and it was the practice even in times of war. A severely hit ship ceased to be an immediate weapon to become a project, a goal for future reconstitution. The mistake started there. On the other side of the Pacific, however, that time did not exist. The war imposed a new logic. The United States, still digesting the flames of Pearl Harbor, had abandoned the peace protocols. Technical improvisation became the rule, not the exception. Urgency was law. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto designs Operation MI, he starts from a solid premise by Japanese standards. 2 American aircraft carriers still operational in the Pacific, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The analysis was corroborated by months of intelligence reports, intercepted signals and assumptions reinforced by a doctrinal conviction. The Americans were slow, too methodical, bureaucratic in their structures. They had industrial strength, but they did not know how to use it under pressure. It was an error of perception, not of information. Because the real problem was not in the photographs or in the technical reports. It was in the cultural filter with which this data was processed. The Japanese Navy understood war as a ceremony of precision. Every move, every decision, every repair followed a flow of hierarchical validations. Time was an element of control. For the Americans, time was the enemy, and against him, improvisation was a weapon. By crossing the Yorktown out of the plans, the Japanese did not eliminate just one vessel. They erased, without realizing it, a disruptive factor. They underestimated what it meant to have civilian workers working 24 hours a day, ignoring manuals, welding in 15-minute shifts, eating standing up, sleeping next to boilers. They underestimated American industry not by size, but by mentality. They did not imagine that the same country that had produced refrigerators and automobiles in Detroit now applied these principles to naval reconstruction. One statistic helps explain the gulf. While Japan built warships almost by hand, with each unit requiring centralized overhaul and structural perfection, the United States standardized parts, systems, and crews so that multiple ships could be repaired or assembled in parallel, even with inexperienced crews. What the Japanese considered incomplete work, the Americans called ready to fight. This difference in doctrine had already manifested itself on other fronts. In North Africa, the Germans were shocked by the number of trucks that the Americans were able to land and put into operation in a few weeks. In 1942, as Germany tried to maintain 30 divisions with logistical support on vulnerable tracks, the United States coordinated 16,000 miles of wheeled supply in North Africa, a decentralized, redundant, and functional transportation network. But Midway would be the first time this doctrine would meet the elite of the Imperial Navy on the open seas. The historical irony is not in the Japanese technical error. It is in the belief that the war would be won on the basis of what has worked in the past, in trusting that the enemy would obey the same rules, in believing that doctrine by itself could shape adversarial behavior. By removing the Yorktown from the equation, Yamamoto relied not only on reports, but on the predictability of enemy engineering. And it is precisely this trust, blind, logical, almost elegant, that makes the error all the more fatal. The Yorktown wasn't just a ship, it was the floating symbol of a changing country, a country that had taken the blow of Pearl Harbor as a starting point, that he now thought in hours, not weeks, who saw functional imperfection as a superior form of efficiency, that he was learning very quickly that the battlefield of the 20th century was defined less by honor and more by scale. And while the Japanese admiral set up a meticulous ambush for 2 aircraft carriers, a third approached like a ghost, a vessel that, according to his calculations, no longer existed, a threat that shouldn't be on the map. And yet, it was. In the files found after the war, a Japanese intelligence officer would write, "All our simulations pointed to 2 ships, and all of our attacks were designed for 2. When reports began to name a 3rd airline group, no one believed it. But at that moment we knew. We had made the mistake of planning against a version of America that no longer existed, and what Japan would discover in the following days is that the mistake was not just in crossing a name off a list, it was in scratching out an entire philosophy of war. Because by the time Yorktown anchored in Pearl Harbor, covered in scars, the war in the Pacific had already changed its nature. And in the next chapter, we will see what happens when an entire country decides to rebuild an aircraft carrier in a hurry, courageously, and fire in the eyes. May 8, 1942. End of the day. The flames were still consuming internal compartments as the USS Yorktown begins its withdrawal from the Coral Sea. Contrary to what Japanese observers predicted, the ship does not sail at 6 knots, the speed of a dying man, but at 20, a rhythm sustained by partially functional boilers, patched turbines, and a crew that, without waiting for orders, was already turning rust into strength. The trip to Pearl Harbor was a 3,300-mile race against time and against statistics. Each day on the high seas was used as an extension of the shipyard. Basements became workshops. Engineering officers, led by Chief Engineer John F. Delaney, distributed tasks as if they were standing at the dock. The work included cutting steel with a blowtorch, emergency welding, redirecting electrical systems, sealing compartments flooded with fast-drying concrete. The damaged fuel tanks were isolated and bypassed with improvised external nets. Nothing followed the standards of the manual. Everything followed the standards of necessity. The Japanese command in Tokyo intercepted encrypted radio signals that indicated the northward movement of an American aircraft carrier. Intelligence assumed with formal logic that it was the Hornet or the Enterprise. The reading of the signs ignored the human factor. He did not know that the Yorktown, supposedly adrift, was already rebuilding itself in motion. It was in the process of rebirth, a rebirth in forced march. In the ship's holds, engineers slept on pieces of insulating blanket. Technicians ate standing up with tools strapped to their pockets. The damaged ventilation system was replaced with cooling motors taken from spare compartments. An aft boiler, originally designed to power aircraft elevators, was reconfigured to assist in the hydraulic steering of the rudders. Nothing was permanent, but everything needed to last long enough. Each mile won brought the ship closer to an even more unlikely destination, to be repaired in less than a week. And this expectation did not come from formal orders, but from a collective understanding. The crew knew that if the Yorktown did not return to the front line, the United States would meet Midway with fatal inferiority. The battle was imminent. Time was the new enemy. Americans understood war as a simultaneous struggle on multiple fronts: physical, industrial, logistical, and symbolic. The Yorktown trip was the ultimate symbol of this understanding. While Japan planned like a chess player, seeking perfect position, symmetry, numerical superiority, the United States acted like firefighters in the midst of an uncontrolled fire. Every minute demanded decision. Every failure was circumvented with improvisation. Every mistake corrected with ingenuity. In an internal U.S. Navy report issued days later, the following observation is made. The Yorktown sailed under technical conditions that would have crippled any vessel with inspection-based doctrine. Its functioning depended entirely on the elasticity of the technical thinking of its officers. The war required just that, elasticity. In parallel, Pearl Harbor was preparing. Civilian technicians were already studying the structural diagram of the Yorktown even before its arrival. Plans for emergency welding, external sealing, and rerouting of power flows were under continuous review. When the ship finally rounded the horizon of Oahu late on May 27th, its appearance was bleak. Oil slicks dragged for 10 miles, the bow deformed, the deck littered with temporary seams. But he sailed, and that was enough to set in motion the most audacious plan ever executed by a waryard. The arrival of the Yorktown at Pearl was witnessed by thousands. Civilians, officers, and workers gathered on the quays. It was more than the arrival of a boat. It was the arrival of a thesis, that the impossible could be reduced to a schedule. In the conning tower, Admiral Chester Nimitz did not wait for reports. Pants rolled up, boots soaked. He climbed aboard himself to assess the damage. He talked to engineers, read graphs, touched the burnt steel with his hands. Next to the shipyard superintendent, Captain Claude Gillette, he asked only one question: how many days? The answer would come in the form of a challenge. We need him ready in 3. This moment was not only a milestone in American war logistics, it was a symbolic break with any previous naval doctrine. Until that moment, repairing a ship in less than a week was an inconceivable task. But over the next 3 days, the concept of naval maintenance would be reinvented. And what would come next would not be a repair. It would be a war operation with blowtorches, cables, and steel plates. In the next chapter, we will see how 400 workers came together under clear orders to make fly what should have been sunk. May 27, 1942, 10 p.m. The USS Yorktown docks at Pearl Harbor under a tension-laden sky. Still steaming, the ship is greeted with silent looks. What you see is not a boat. It is a patient in critical condition. But at that moment, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz, while personally inspecting the damage to the hull and deck, makes a decision that would not cross the mind of a Japanese officer. The ship needs to be ready in 72 hours. Not because it would be ideal, but because it was necessary. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, and it didn't involve more metal, it involved mindset. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and seeing how war was also won with civilian tools, like and subscribe, so we can continue to bring you more forgotten stories from World War II. What begins in the early hours of the 28th is an unprecedented industrial and human effort. Still ankle-deep in water as the dry dock emptied, more than 1,400 civilian workers entered Yorktown as if heading for the front. Welders, electricians, sheet metal fitters, boiler makers, and maintenance workers fanned out across the ship's 5 levels. There was no time for detailed planning. Every minute was fought with improvisation. The internal structure deformed by the explosions would not be rebuilt. It would be sealed. Steel plates were welded directly onto twisted sections. Holes were filled with steel-reinforced scaffolding wood. The damaged fuel tanks, which had contaminated hundreds of gallons of oil, were insulated with fast-drying cement, originally designed for airstrips. Instead of changing all the electrical piping, the electricians extended 35 miles of new cables over the top of hallways, hatches, and walls. The hull received 20 tons of steel reinforcements in key areas. Every hammer, every weld, every wire pulled was a step against the clock. Decisions did not rise through hierarchies. They were taken on the spot. Supervisors delegated solutions directly on deck without reporting. A worker saw a hole. Another carried a sign. A third sold. It was chaos, but a productive chaos. Japanese doctrine based on approval and technical ritual would never conceive of such a thing. There, perfection was a prerequisite. Here, the fight was the only criterion. Captain Claude Gillette, who was in charge of the shipyard, would later report, "We did not repair the ship. We made it work." That was the spirit. No one promised a Yorktown as new. What was promised, and fulfilled, was a ship that could launch planes at Midway. The workers worked 3 days in a row, alternating shifts of 12 hours, then 8, then none. Many slept leaning against bulkheads. Others ate by welding. At one point, the ship's electrical consumption was so high that it caused intermittent blackouts on Oahu. When the shipyard needed more wood to reinforce fragile compartments, the island's construction companies sent trucks without a contract, without bidding, without questions. A Japanese naval engineer, years after the war, while studying the repair logs, was silent for minutes. Then he just said, That wasn't engineering, it was collective instinct. But it was precisely this instinct that transformed a doomed ship into an operational vessel in just 3 days. On May 30th at 09 wire, Yorktown left Pearl Harbor with workers still aboard. They continued welding as the ship accelerated. From a distance, it looked like a makeshift boat, but up close, it was a functional fighting machine, ready to amaze Japanese eyes. And the surprise would be total, because what the enemy would see on the horizon, in the skies of Midway, would not just be a ship that should not be there, but the materialization of a miscalculation. And in the next episode, we'll see how this mistake would turn into terror when the Yorktown reappeared, flying. On May 29, 1942, the pale morning light casts over the deck of the USS Yorktown, still hot from freshly applied welds. The metallic sound of the hammers mixes with the deafening roar of the first propulsion tests. The vessel looks patched, marked by overlapping signs, exposed wires, and broken paint. But everything that needs to work, works. Each critical system had been restored not to last for years but to endure days. The ship would not return to sea with aesthetic perfection. It would return as a combat platform. That was what mattered. The question that guided every decision in the halls of Yorktown was not, does it conform to the manual end, but rather, does it work? And if the answer was yes, he would move on. Plates that were to be cut to size were bent with a sledgehammer and welded in real time. Electrical cables, which in the original design ran through internal conduits, now crossed corridors and stairs and exposed circuits. When one of the fuel tanks could not be pressurized, engineers chose to divert its contents to secondary tanks, even if it meant losing range. The goal wasn't to achieve the ideal, it was to reach Midway. In Japan, this type of practice would be unthinkable. Japanese technical doctrine, influenced by decades of British naval engineering and its own codes of conduct, valued ritualistic perfection. A ship was only considered combatant if it fully conformed to the standards. In the United States, born of a culture of mass production and functional pragmatism, effectiveness came before elegance. The difference was philosophical. In the Pacific, this difference would become lethal. The orders on board were short, direct. Take off, deflect pressure, insulate the compartment. There was no room for hesitation. One of the aircraft elevators, still with hydraulic failures, was operated manually with adapted auxiliary systems. The radar, damaged by shrapnel, was partially reactivated with external connections, allowing the ship to track planes up to 70 miles away. None of the systems were 100%, but none were useless. And this concept of enough to fight was not just technical, it was moral. The workers who assembled the ammunition mounts knew that their job was not to ensure durability, it was to ensure that a fighter could be refueled, armed, and relaunched in minutes. Urgency replaced perfectionism. American culture, forged in the production of millions of automobiles a year, knew how to operate under deadlines, scarcity, and error. At the Pearl Harbor shipyards, many of these workers came from civilian industry. They had experience in train assembly, bridge construction, merchant ship engines. They brought to the warship the factory thinking, what matters is to deliver. The result was an aircraft carrier rebuilt not as a masterpiece, but as a tool of attack. This mentality would be repeated in hundreds of situations throughout the war. Sherman tanks would be delivered with parts replaced with tractor components. B-17 bombers would fly with redundant systems that were inoperative but had functional armament. The goal was clear: to keep the flow, to keep the pressure, to keep the presence. Germany, by contrast, produced less and demanded more. Its Panzer IV tanks underwent close inspections. Their submarines required millimeter accuracy of assembly. The quality was high, but the cadence was slow. While the Germans produced 1 tank per day, the Americans produced 12. While the Japanese calibrated each torpedo by hand, the Americans produced it in series, testing by sampling. The war of precision against the war of repetition. Yorktown would become a symbol of this clash. She was not a restored ship. It was a floating manifesto of gross efficiency. Each scar on the hoof said to the enemy, "You were wrong to count on our slowness." Every makeshift radar, every crooked weld, every outer panel hung by reinforced chains, was the embodiment of a combat philosophy that didn't require applause. It required impact. In less than 72 hours after repairs began, the Yorktown left Pearl Harbor sailing at full power. Their planes were already on board. Operational officers coordinated tests at sea. Civilian workers were still welding anti-aircraft gun bases as the ship advanced. It was a vision that defied any 19th century naval logic, but in the 20th century it would become the norm. And in the Japanese command, the war's accounting was already wrong, because where 2 aircraft carriers were waiting, they would find 3. Where they expected doctrine, they would find improvisation. Where they expected fragility, they would find a system that prioritized action over appearance. In the next chapter, we will see the impact of this unexpected presence, the exact moment when the Japanese binoculars spot, on the Midway horizon, the silhouette of a ship that, for them, was dead, and the silent terror that sets in when they realize that their calculations have been betrayed by reality. May 30th, 1942. At 09 Zl, the USS Yorktown slowly detaches from the dock at Pearl Harbor. The structure still exudes the acrid smell of welded metal. Civilian workers remain on board, finishing the last repairs on the move. The ship carries on its decks the urgency of a nation, and in its entrails, the continuous sound of engines tested beyond the limit. The scars of the Coral Sea are still visible. Explosion marks, oil stains, steel panels welded over holes that were once the ship's lungs. But now, he breathes again. The crossing to Point Luck, a strategic location north of Midway, takes place at operational speed. Yorktown doesn't drag on, he says. At its side, an escort task force guarantees protection, but it is the ship itself that imposes its presence. The embarked air group had been hastily assembled. F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, experienced riders mixed with newcomers. None of them knew if the elevator would fail, but everyone knew they would be flying soon. When Yorktown meets the Enterprise and Hornet at sea, there is a moment of silence on the radio channel. Identify yourself. The answer comes without hesitation. CV-5, ready for operation. On the Enterprise's gangway, Admiral Raymond Spruance slowly removes the binoculars. The scene before him is unlikely. The ship that should have been in dry dock, or perhaps at the bottom of the sea, now forms the third vertex of a full strike force. Incredulity turns into strategic advantage. The mere presence of Yorktown transforms the entire balance of the operation. The Japanese plans, based on a 4-on-2 duel, would now face off 4-on-3, and more importantly, without the surprise. Japan thought it would start Midway with air superiority, but the reappearance of Yorktown changed not only the numbers, it changed the spirit. The technical details were still uncertain. Propulsion had been restored, but operated under limitations. One of the main elevators showed signs of instability. An approach radar was installed in an improvised way with reduced range. Part of the anti-aircraft system was being manually adjusted. Still, the deck was already functional. Initial tests confirmed it. Takeoffs and landings were possible. The function had been restored. On May 31st, Yorktown conducts its first air operation after repair. 3 Wildcat fighters take off with full armament. The sound of their engines tearing through the sky is more than a sign of readiness. It is a message sent directly to Japanese calculations. What you thought was eliminated survived, and now it attacks. The technical philosophy that reassembled the Yorktown finds its full expression here. The ship is not pretty, but it is in the right place at the right time, doing exactly what it needs to do. The industrial pragmatism of the United States had overcome the theoretical perfection of the enemy, and for the first time, American officials feel they have a real chance to hold out. In the Japanese command, however, there is still no perception of the failure. Yamamoto's fleet reports continue to state, only 2 enemy aircraft carriers available. The certainty remains unshaken. After all, the damage of the Coral Sea was witnessed. The time required for a repair, 90 days, was an accepted truth based on its own parameters. It is this mismatch between belief and reality that would open the first crack in Japanese logic. Because war, like industry, does not forgive those who underestimate the enemy's time. And while the Yorktown took up combat position alongside its brethren, the Japanese approached Midway, certain of victory. But what they would see in a few hours, in the field of vision of their optical lenses, would shatter that trust to pieces. In the next chapter, you'll witness the exact moment when the ship thought to be dead is seen flying, and how it marks the beginning of the downfall of the entire Japanese task force. At dawn on June 4, 1942, The Japanese fleet approached Midway with the confidence of those who dominate the ocean. Ahead, 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, advanced with surgical precision, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in impeccable formation. At the heart of the operation, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo coordinated the attacks based on meticulously updated intelligence reports. According to all available data, the Americans would have a maximum of 2 aircraft carriers ready, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The third, Yorktown, had been crossed out of the plans for weeks, and for good reason. Doctrinal logic said he couldn't be there. This logic was not the result of carelessness. It was an entire naval doctrine. Japanese military culture was based on the idea of symmetry. Whole ships face whole ships. A damaged hull represents dishonor and risk. A damaged vessel is sent to the rear, not to combat. War, for them, was a game of chess. No damaged pieces should remain on the board. And so the error began not in the statistics but in the way they were interpreted. Japanese doctrine did not conceive of the concept of a functionally improvised ship. The American concept of combat-ready was incomprehensible. A radar attached with external cables, a manually operated aircraft elevator, a tank sealed with concrete. To the Japanese, this was a workaround. For Americans, it was a solution. And at that moment, this difference in technical culture would become a tactical abyss. At 06:32 a.m., a Japanese air patrol reports eye contact with U.S. naval forces northeast of Midway. The transmission is unclear, but it mentions 3 aircraft carriers. The radio operator hesitates. Intelligence officials dismiss the number. They must have mistaken a battleship for an aircraft carrier. After all, only 2 are operational. But within seconds, the truth begins to break Japanese logic like a crack in a pressurized hull. Reconnaissance planes send back deck images, full air groups, and triple attack formation. 3 distinct ships lined up, maneuvering with armed planes and ready, and one of them has a familiar silhouette: the eyelet tower, the position of the elevators, the length of the deck. It's Yorktown. The surprise is not only strategic, it is philosophical. He shouldn't be there. The calculations were correct, but the premise was false. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy obsessively cross-referenced data. They knew how many tanks the United States could make in a month. They knew how many planes a week left the Grumman and Douglas lines. They knew how many troops could be transported by rail. But what they didn't understand was the ability to function outside the standards. This mistake was not exclusive to the Japanese. The Germans, on the other side of the world, made the same mistake of judgment. By 1942, Germany was producing about 6,000 aircraft per month. The United States, in the same period, exceeded 11,000. But Hitler's planners believed that his tactical superiority would make up for the quantitative inferiority. That one German plane was technically more advanced, and therefore 2 could hit 5. The American production contradicted this mathematics. By 1943, the United States would build more than 86,000 tanks, while Germany would produce just over 19,000. A brutal difference. And yet, the Axis logic was the same: to underestimate the practical efficiency of the enemy. If this statistic also surprised you, leave it in the comments. Absolute power. Or write down how you felt with a phrase like logistics wins, or shocking data, because sometimes the numbers say more than the bombs. Back in the Pacific, the Japanese admirals begin plan adjustments with fatal delay. The doctrine required formality, reconfirmations, lightning meetings to change the load of the planes. Bombers that had been prepared to attack Midway would now need to be reconfigured to attack aircraft carriers. And this exchange would take time. Time that the Americans, with their doctrine of flexibility and immediate action, would not give. The reappearance of Yorktown was not just a miscalculation. It was the materialization of an ideological error. Japan expected a controlled war. It would receive an improvised war, and, precisely for this reason, more efficient. In the next chapter, we will see how this breach of logic plunged the Imperial Navy into a cycle of late decisions, while the Americans were already approaching with armed bombers, ready to wipe off the map what, until then, was considered invincible. At 07:10 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo was still examining incomplete reports when the first groups of American torpedo bombers appeared on radar. They came at low altitude in scattered formation with no fighter cover. A desperate attack, it seemed. Japanese officers believed they were seeing the first wave of 2 aircraft carriers, but there was one non-standard detail: the number of aircraft. They were more than expected. The simple visual count already indicated a calculation error. The radars confirmed too many contacts, more squads than there should be. A technical, almost mathematical detail began to erode the confidence of the Imperial Navy. The number of planes in the air was the visible symptom of the invisible flaw, the presence of the Yorktown. It wasn't just another ship. It was the collapse of an entire doctrinal structure. At the Japanese command, the discomfort spread quickly. The carriers were vulnerable, decks exposed, planes refueling, bombs scattered around hangars. The time it took to reconfigure the bombers, which were prepared to attack targets on land, not vessels, was a minimum of 45 minutes. But the American planes would arrive first. Urgency has taken the place of confidence. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese improvised. The Yorktown, despite the patches, was already operating at full throttle. Her Devastator torpedo boats were the first to take off. Next, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The deck worked. The elevators lifted aircraft. The radar tracked movements. What Japan had considered impossible, a ship struggling with open scars, now launched waves of attack with precision and coordination. The psychology of the battle had changed. On the American side, the presence of Yorktown re-established hope for balance. On the Japanese side, doubt has set in. The squadrons sent for air cover were now disorganized, searching for multiple targets simultaneously. The original plan was to face 2 predictable adversaries. Now they faced 3, and one of them, presumed dead. At 10:22 a.m., 3 bombs pierced the deck of the Akagi. 4 minutes later, Kaga is hit in sequence. The attacks came at an angle, plunging straight from the skies through torn clouds. The bombers took off from the Enterprise, but the disorganization the Japanese faced was amplified by the presence of the 3rd carrier. The mathematics of air defense had collapsed. There were not enough fighters in the air to intercept all the strike groups. From the deck of the Yorktown, officers watched plumes of smoke rising over the horizon. The communications confirm 2 targets hit. What follows is the tactical realization that the scales had turned. The enemy, once surgical, is now retreating. The Yorktown bombers were still in the air. The battle was in full rotation, and the effects of the surprise, added to the Japanese logistical chaos, became irreversible. This change in balance was not an accident. It was the direct product of a culture that prioritized readiness over protocol. The difference was on the factory floor, in the shipyards, in the quick decisions of the civilian supervisors at Pearl Harbor. The American machine, even improvised, proved to be more resilient than the Japanese gear, which demanded perfection before acting. In the Japanese logbooks, we find a note made by a radio lieutenant at 11:03 a.m. Number of enemy squadrons exceeds forecast. Possible 3rd aircraft carrier, confirm. The message never received a response. The chaos of Midway was already installed. Japanese doctrine, which demanded absolute control of the scenario, simply lacked the tools to react to the unpredictable. From a logistical point of view, the difference between the powers was increasingly visible. While the Japanese operated with 6 aircraft carriers across the Pacific, the United States, by the end of 1942, would already have 15 in operation or advanced construction. American naval production followed a pace that defied any European or Asian expectations. The same goes for airplanes. Each month, 5,000 combat aircraft left the American production lines, compared to less than 1,000 for the Japanese, a proportion that would seal the fate of the conflict. If this contrast between the power of production and the arrogance of the doctrine caught your attention, comment below, Mathematics 1, or write in your own words what you felt in the face of this strategic turn. Late in the morning of June 4th, Yorktown was still sailing. He was still launching planes. And more than that, it symbolized the idea that sometimes it is enough to be present to turn the tide of a war. In the next chapter, we'll look at the Japanese counterattack and how the Yorktown, even patched up, would face a new wave of bombers. The ship that was not supposed to exist now would become the center of the battle, and he would pay the price for it. At 10:40 a.m. on June 4th, the Akagi's command room was a theater of disorientation. Maps were pulled and redrawn, radar reports contradicted visual observers, and the number of American aircraft in the air had already exceeded any plausible prediction. The chaos didn't just come from the bombs that were starting to fall. It came from the silent realization that the calculations were wrong, deeply wrong. On a board drawn with mathematical logic, someone had introduced an invisible variable: improvisation. Japanese doctrine was not prepared for the unexpected. The American attack did not follow the pattern. Successive, uncoordinated waves with aircraft of varying types came from different vectors. In theory, this would indicate disorganization. In practice, it generated saturation. The Japanese fighters protecting the aircraft carriers were forced to fragment their formation to intercept simultaneous targets. The anti-aircraft defense fired in several directions at once, reducing its effectiveness. And as the dauntless bombers dived from oblique angles, hitting Kaga and Soryu within minutes, the realization became inevitable. There were more than 2 American aircraft carriers operating. The problem was philosophical. The Imperial Navy had designed its entire campaign based on a war of predictability. One knew what the enemy could do and what he could not. It was known how many days it would take a ship to return to active duty. It was known that, based on Western doctrine, damaged ships were considered inoperable. That was the rule. But on that day, the rule had been broken. The presence of Yorktown not only added strength, I subtracted logic. Staff officers on the Akagi reviewed spreadsheets and battle manuals in order to fit the observations into the models. But the models had been created by engineers and theorists, not by workers at Pearl Harbor. Each bomb dropped by the Yorktown planes was, in fact, a break in the mental structure of the Japanese strategists. By 11 a.m., the Soryu was already ablaze. The aircraft elevators had collapsed. Secondary explosions turned the lower hangar into a steel furnace. The Kaga, hit by multiple bombs, was beginning to list. On the Akagi, officers were still trying to relocate planes from the upper hangar when the deck was pierced. Hiryu remained unharmed, but now isolated. The battle had changed its nature. It was no longer a symmetrical exchange of forces. It was an asymmetrical demolition of Japanese doctrine. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the American machine kept turning. In the month of June 1942, the United States was launching 1 battleship a day, 1 ship per day, not just noting, building from scratch. For every torpedo boat lost at Midway, another 5 would be produced in the following weeks. For every aircraft carrier damaged, there were parts and workers already mobilized. The war had ceased to be a duel between fleets and had become a duel between systems, and the American system, with all its industrial brutality, was beginning to crush the elegant assumptions of the enemy. In Japanese doctrine, there was beauty in the method: attack rituals, takeoff patterns, timed orders with ceremonial precision. But Midway revealed the limit of this refinement. When the battle went off script, rigidity became weakness. American improvisation, disorganized, sometimes chaotic, proved to be more lethal because it responded to the present, not to theory. In Admiral Nagumo's war diary, there is a 3-word note made that day, shortly after the collapse of the Kaga: impossible number confirmed. It was the recognition, still veiled, that reality had surpassed the plan. That something, a human, technical, or cultural variable, had entered the equation and destroyed its symmetry. And this variable had a name: velocity, speed in decision-making, speed in repair, speed in production, speed in adaptation. On all these fronts, the United States was superior, not because their soldiers were better, but because their systems allowed for failures, because American industrial culture accepted functional imperfection as a means to win. In Japan, this was heresy. In Japan, an airplane only flies if it is perfect. A ship only fights if it is whole. But at Midway, it was the opposite that won. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the Yorktown, already revealed and now targeted, will face the brunt of the Japanese backlash, and how even when hit again it will continue to function. Because war, from then on, would no longer be about invulnerability. It would be about permanence. And in this, the Americans were already far ahead. Yorktown was already scheduled. Smoke still escaped from isolated points of its superstructure, remnants of hasty welding and metal patches applied days before. The naval painting had not even been redone. There were dark gray spots where camouflage had existed before, and yet he breathed and responded. At 11:15 a.m., with the sky still congested with enemy formations and plumes of smoke rising from the horizon, The Yorktown crew begins a new sequence of launches. The planes were armed, the tanks filled, the pilots ready. But it was the deck that counted. There was no margin for error. The heat from the recent weld had slightly deformed the alignment of one of the elevator tracks. Electrical cables still ran outside the conduits, secured with cable ties and makeshift supports. On a Japanese inspection, that ship was reportedly declared inoperable, but there was no time for inspections. The first Dauntless accelerated with full force. The engine roared over still hot steel plates, welded under pressure and with no time for finishing. The plane launched into the air, worked. A second followed, then a third. The rhythm has settled. The Yorktown was back to doing what it did before it was hit in the Coral Sea, attacking. The target was the Soryu, a mainstay of the Japanese strike force. Already under pressure from the first waves, the carrier had not yet been hit directly. The bombs dropped by the Yorktown planes would seal their fate. Two hit the deck, penetrating the hangar and exploding over fueled torpedo boats. A third detonates a few meters from the stern elevator. The fire spreads in seconds. The hull trembles. The flames feed on the stored fuel itself. In less than 15 minutes, the Soryu is engulfed in black smoke. The crew begins the evacuation. From the Yorktown radio, the confirmation signals arrive. Target hit. Secondary combustion. Deck out of operation. And on the gangway, American officers, exhausted, covered in sweat, realized the profound significance of those transmissions. It was not only a successful attack, it was the validation of a choice. The ship that had been reported sunk days earlier now destroyed Japanese naval pride. And it did so with improvised technology, with patched structures with functionality prioritized over aesthetics. The Japanese, observing the pattern of the bombings, realized that it was not just Enterprise and Hornet in operation. The third shadow in the sky confirmed the presence of Yorktown. Logic broke, and with it, morals. Because if a ship like that could get back into the fight so quickly, what else would the enemy be able to do? It is at this point that war ceases to be just about fleets. It becomes about decision culture. The Yorktown attack wasn't just effective, it was symbolic. Every plane launched from that rusty deck was a cry of resistance against paralyzing perfectionism, an affirmation that, in a war of attrition, he who responds quickly wins. And the American response had a name, a process, and a method. It was the synthesis of a system where civil engineers worked side by side with naval officers, where temporary solutions were encouraged, where good enough was understood as the difference between being outside or inside the battle. In the end, the Japanese did not lose the Soryu only to bombs. They lost to speed, for the doctrine that accepted flying with exposed cables and concrete sealants. The sight of the Yorktown dropping fighters under smoke and hitting crumbled the myth of Japanese technical superiority, because it was no longer a question of having the most refined ship. It was to have the ship present. The U.S. Navy proved that it didn't have to win by form. He would win for his role. And if this idea impacted you, remember the number. 3 days. Within 3 days, that ship went from what the Japanese called a dead hull to a lethal machine in operation. Comment below. 3 days are enough. And tell us what this turn says about the power of action against hesitation. In the next chapter, Yorktown will finally get the price of its boldness. Hiryu's counterattack is already on the way. And what lies ahead is not just an enemy onslaught. It is the final proof that war does not forgive even heroes. At 1:38 p.m. on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A bombers plunge over the Pacific in tense silence. They come from the Hiryu, the last of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers still functional. Their targets, radar signals and visual coordinates that point to an isolated American aircraft carrier. Big, slow, limping. No Japanese officer imagines that they are about to attack the same ship that had been declared sunk weeks earlier. For them, this is a new American unit. A third target, fresh, vulnerable. The bombs hit Yorktown with ruthless precision. One explodes near the chimney, sending fragments all over the flight deck. Another hits near the command island, killing and wounding dozens. The impact strikes at the heart of the vessel, and for a moment, everything stops. Smoke, silence. The feeling that now, yes, the ship has come to an end. The attack was brutal, but not absolute. The damage control teams go into action with the speed that had already defined the history of that ship. Water jets, foam, Improvised ceiling. The plates welded on Pearl Harbor resist. External electrical cables, stretched hurriedly through the corridors, continue to feed the control panels. The radar is working again, and the elevators, even hesitantly, still respond. The Yorktown is wounded, but not out of action. For the second time in less than a month, the ship denies its own end. And this shakes more than the Japanese technical staff. It shakes the imagination. From Hiryu, new strike groups are launched. This time, Nakajima B-5N torpedo boats. The target is still on the radar. The Japanese have no doubt. It is another aircraft carrier, a new enemy. And when they see the same hoof, the same silhouette, they begin to doubt. Would it be the same? Impossible. At 3:30 p.m., 2 torpedoes hit the starboard Yorktown. The vessel rocks, heels, decelerates. The main energy drops. For the first time, the ship loses propulsion. The conning tower orders partial evacuation. Crew members jump into the sea. But the sealed compartments at Pearl, those patches frowned upon by Japanese orthodoxy, hold the hull together. Yorktown keeps afloat. The ship that should not exist now survives a second attack. The Japanese, convinced that they had destroyed 2 separate aircraft carriers, report in Tokyo a victory that did not occur. Japanese intelligence reports 2 ships sunk, 1 on fire. The reality: it's the same ship fighting in chapters. This resistance does not come from steel. It comes from doctrine. The American philosophy of war accepts the unfinished, the functional, the sufficient. What the Germans called a workaround, the Americans called adaptation. While the Japanese waited 90 days to return a ship to sea, the Americans delivered 72 hours. Pause. One fact needs to be remembered. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 151 aircraft carriers. Japan, only 25. The difference is not only in the production, but in the belief that it was possible to do the impossible. If this number surprised you, comment "absolute power" and share how this scale changes your view of war. At sea, the war continued. The Yorktown could no longer launch planes, but his crew still struggled to save him. And from a distance, the symbolic effect of his persistence spread. The Japanese had relied on a logistical breakdown, and what they found was a culture of redundancy, speed, and resilience. When the Yorktown was towed, slowly eastward, even wounded, it still fulfilled its role. Absorb attacks, keep the Japanese focused on a target, prevent the Enterprise and Hornet from being detected. In the next chapter, we will see how this ship, floating above logic, became the target of submarines, and how the very insistence on living would make it the ultimate victim of a torpedo, because even technical heroes have a limit. But the lesson had already been left, and she would not be forgotten. While the USS Yorktown held out at sea, there was another front line that was never celebrated with medals, but without which the ship would never have appeared at Midway. It stood ashore in the blazing Pearl Harbor sun, and was staffed by men who used welding torches instead of rifles, cables instead of ammunition, and courage without uniforms. There were 2,400 civilians, workers, engineers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, mechanics, painters. In continuous shifts without pause, these men worked for 3 days and 3 nights, with an unthinkable goal: to return a mutilated aircraft carrier to war in 72 hours. They did not fight in the Pacific, but decided their course with every bolt tightened. The atmosphere was one of constant exhaustion. Few slept more than 2 hours at a time. Many did not even leave the pier. The heat of Hawaii added to the heat of the welds, and the ship's structures still radiated smoke from the previous battle. Deformed sheets were molded with sledgehammers. Electrical systems were rewired outside the standards. Communication cables were pulled through improvised corridors, hanging from the ceiling. Nothing was beautiful. Everything was functional. The big difference was in the decision model. In Japanese doctrine, a repair of this level would require dozens of approvals, consultation of diagrams, sending reports to Tokyo. In Pearl, all it took was one question: does it work? If so, it was done. It didn't matter if it was in the manual. There was no time for manual. There were only 72 hours. Admiral Nimitz's orders were clear. The ship had to set sail. But it was not the hierarchy that moved the workers. It was the sense of collective urgency. Each knew that the time they saved in their work could be the difference between victory and defeat in the Pacific. This culture of autonomy, where even the youngest of technicians could make a critical decision, was what made the American system lethal, flexible, resilient. In Japan, engineering decisions required deference. In Pearl, they demanded initiative, and this initiative was multiplied by the scale of production. While Yorktown was being repaired, other ships were already being assembled at shipyards on the mainland. An escort carrier was launched every 26 days. At the height of the war, American industry produced a complete battleship every 24 hours. The difference between this and the Japanese effort was abysmal. In 1942, Japan produced 8 large ships. The United States, more than 60. If this statistic seems unbelievable, write in the comments, "Shocking data." Because what history revealed was that American power wasn't just on the seas, it was in the invisible hands that kept them sailing. One of Pearl's engineers, when interviewed decades later, summed it up. "We didn't have time to think about heroism. We just had time to think about the next pipe, the next weld." Another commented that his father had lost 2 sons at the front and decided to stay 72 hours straight on the dock, non-stop, as if that were his form of combat. And in fact it was. The Yorktown returned to sea not by luck, nor just by strategy. He came back because of calloused hands, clothes stained with grease, and a spirit that said, "If it can work, it will work." That's the real difference between the ship that was declared sunk and the ship that showed up, whole enough to launch fighters. Japan never understood this. Germany much less. For them, war was a sequence of doctrines. For the Americans, it was a sequence of decisions. In the next chapter, we will see how this philosophy, born on the docks, between hammers and welds, would begin to spread throughout the Allied war effort. And how Yorktown, even if it falls slowly, would still teach one more lesson: that keeping something running is often more powerful than building it from scratch. When the USS Yorktown joined the Enterprise and the Hornet at the rallying point called Point Luck, it wasn't just the Japanese who were surprised. American officers, veterans of previous battles, looked at the patched ship with incredulous eyes. The conning tower still bore visible marks from the bombings. Parts of the deck had different colorations, exposed welds, unfinished structures. But the fighters were lined up. The elevators worked. Air operations were ongoing. Yorktown had not only reappeared, it was operating at full capacity, and that had a profound impact on American naval doctrine. What was once an emergency feat began to be seen as a new standard. Captains who had previously followed manuals now discussed ways to simplify them. Damage control teams began to train no longer in static simulations, but in real-time crisis scenarios. Naval bases adapted structures for emergency repairs. Hornet officers reported that Yorktown's performance altered perceptions of what was recoverable in combat. If that ship could take off fighters after 2 direct blasts and a 3-day session of improvised repairs, what else could be saved? On the West Coast, the Navy Department ordered a review of shipyard procedures. Portable equipment, emergency sealing kits, mobile tools, everything was stockpiled in quantity. Floating bases were designed. Mobile workshops were loaded onto support ships. The logic was simple. Hoping for perfection cost lives. Acting with speed, even under imperfection, could save the war. This turnaround did not happen by decree. It happened by contagion. The Yorktown example was analyzed in meetings, discussed in memos, cited in trainings. The American doctrine of combat, hitherto based on the rigidity of pre-Pearl Harbor systems, now absorbed flexibility as a virtue. Captain George Murray, commander of the Enterprise, summed up the impact in a letter. "What I saw on that ship was a functional demonstration of faith, a ship that had already died twice and was still fighting. We can no longer think about combat without thinking about immediate recovery." More than inspiring, Yorktown created a precedent. In less than 2 months, emergency repair protocols began to be taught at naval academies. The concept of minimum acceptable operability was introduced, a metric that assessed whether a ship could fight even before it was completely restored. What was once an exception became doctrine, and that shaped not only ships but also men. The generation of officers who witnessed Yorktown at Midway came to rely less on predictions and more on the ability to adapt. Modern warfare demanded this. In an internal Japanese naval intelligence report, intercepted months later, an officer wrote, "The Americans accept structural flaws as part of combat. They don't wait for the ship to be complete. They throw it into the sea with what they have. We need to review our idea of readiness. But it was too late. American culture had understood the lesson. Speed beats rigidity, and imperfect efficiency is more lethal than late perfection. In the next chapter, we will see how this philosophy was not restricted to the Navy. Factories, trains, airfields, and even infantry units would adopt the fit-to-fight mentality, and what began with a patched ship would go on to govern the largest logistical effort in military history. When the fires finally ceased over the Pacific, the scenario was irreversible. 4 of the Imperial Navy's 6 attack carriers were destroyed. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ships that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, ships that made up the elite First Air Fleet, ships that carried decades of strategic investment, were sunk in just 24 hours. Japan had lost not only tonnage or firepower, but the backbone of its offensive doctrine. For the first time since the beginning of the war, imperial strategists faced the impossibility. They would not be able to replace what they have lost. The reason was not only in the size of the defeat, but in the nature of the system that sustained it. The Japanese shipping industry was built for refinement. Each aircraft carrier was a meticulous, almost artisanal work, with unique components, unique processes, limited specialists. Rebuilding a Kaga would take years. The problem wasn't a lack of will, it was a lack of a scalable method. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the United States was starting a tide that could no longer be stemmed. In June 1942, a few days after Midway, the Newport News shipyard was already testing the production line of the new Essex class, larger, faster-to-build aircraft carriers with standardized systems. Each unit took between 14 and 18 months to be ready, but after standardization, this average fell by half. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. would launch 24 ships of this class. Japan would launch 3. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was no secret. It was scale. While Japan perfected, America multiplied. While a Japanese naval engineer prided himself on the precision of one weld, an American was already welding the next. This philosophical difference became lethal. If you are enjoying unraveling these contrasts that decided the course of the war, like and subscribe so that we can continue to bring you detailed content like this. Midway, therefore, was not just a battle. It was the industrial inflection point. Yorktown was the symbol, but what came after it consolidated the turnaround. The U.S. Navy learned from the crisis. He created mobile damage control schools. He automated factories, introduced interchangeable parts into naval systems. The waiting time for repair has dropped. Mass production was applied to battleships, submarines, destroyers, planes, support vehicles, ammunition. And all of this revolved around one philosophy: speed with functionality. The ideal was not the perfect ship, it was the finished ship. This mentality, initiated in the heat of the Yorktown emergency, has spread as official doctrine. And while the United States accelerated, Japan sank. Literally. In less than a year, the Imperial Navy would never again be able to launch an offensive operation with the same force. The units that remained were too valuable to risk. Its pilots, many of whom were Pearl Harbor veterans, were dead. Their shipyards bombed. Its steel and fuel reserves in free fall. On the American side, each lost ship was replaced with 2. Each pilot killed was replaced with a trained squadron. By 1943, U.S. war doctrine no longer relied on improvisation. He counted on abundance. The logic was relentless. If a ship can be hit, it will be. If a plane can crash, it will. The secret was never to depend on just one. That thought began on the damaged deck of the Yorktown, but it consolidated at the bottom of the Pacific, on the wreckage of Japanese ships sunk at Midway. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this turn expanded into the air, and how American naval dominance came to be sustained by a sky filled with fighters, bombers, and pilots trained at assembly line pace. Because from then on, Japan no longer faced only ships. He was facing a gear. And gears, unlike men, don't get tired. 4 days after the Battle of Midway, the Yorktown was still afloat. Damaged, wounded, and already evacuated of essential crew, it awaited towing, a last-ditch attempt to be saved for future operations. But at 1:30 p.m. on June 6, 1942, the invisible shadow of a Japanese submarine, the I-168, would seal its fate. 2 torpedoes hit the weakened hull. The impact was not only physical, it was symbolic. Japan did not sink just one ship. It sank the very illusion that the enemy would not resist. Because even going to the bottom, Yorktown had already won. Its sinking was not an end. It was an exclamation point in what was already an irreversible strategic victory. The torpedoing was precise, deliberate, an act of insistence. The Japanese knew that the carrier had already been hit, but the I-168 was sent with a clear mission, to ensure that what was still floating around would not return. However, this linear logic, that a ship is only useful if it remains standing, failed to understand the new paradigm of war. Yorktown had already fulfilled its role. Their planes had taken off. His attacks had hit. His mere presence had disorganized the enemy's plans. The war had already been shaped by his action. And this represents the heart of the strategic lesson. The value of a military asset lies not only in its physical integrity, but in its temporal utility. The Yorktown, with makeshift repairs, patched structure, and emergency systems still operating, defied all Japanese logic that a damaged ship was a dead ship. It didn't just function under unlikely conditions, it influenced the course of the war. As she slowly sank, leaning alongside starboard, her silent, now empty deck seemed to carry more than evacuated crewmen. They carried the central thesis of the emerging American doctrine. A ship fighting for 72 hours can change the fate of a 3-year battle. Japan saw a sinking ship. The United States has seen a validated method. This paradox has not gone unnoticed by attentive observers. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in a report to the Navy, wrote, "Yorktown has been lost, but the method which returned her to war will be multiplied. And if one ship could do that, 10 will do more." And that's exactly what happened. The damage control doctrine has been reformulated. Pragmatism was institutionalized. Shipyards were reoriented to accept war as a continuous state, not an exception. Improvisation became a competence. The death of Yorktown was therefore his greatest claim. By sinking, he proved that it was not necessary to last to win. It was necessary to arrive, operate, fulfill function, influence the battlefield, even for a few days. Japan, which so valued permanence and technical perfection, lost to an enemy that valued immediate use and adaptation. The Yorktown did not sink as a symbol of weakness. It sank as a monument to a new kind of force, that which exists as long as it is useful, even if temporary. And this new thinking would soon spread beyond the fleet, because while one ship fell, others were already assembled. The American assembly line did not stop. She was not moved by losses. She replaced. It expanded. It automated. In the next chapter, we will let the hull of the Yorktown rest in the depths and look upwards, to the sky, where the logic of rapid replacement, mass training, and logistical supremacy would begin to rewrite Pacific air warfare. Because what was started by workers at Pearl Harbor would soon become standard in the fighter factories that would supply the aircraft carriers that were yet to come. Midway wasn't just a battle won, it was a concept revealed. The first great mirror between two worlds, two ways of thinking, of making, of fighting. On one side, Japan, naval tradition, codified honor, vertical hierarchy, excellence as the absolute goal. On the other, the United States, serial industry, decentralized command, operational urgency, efficiency as a priority. When Yorktown reappeared at Midway, it not only contradicted the calculations of Japanese intelligence, he destroyed a philosophical conviction that only technical perfection wins. Because there, floating under crooked plates, with makeshift cables and a still hot welding deck, was a new war thesis, that speed, function, and resilience trump aesthetics, ritual, and foresight. This thesis was not born in the high command, nor in the offices of the White House. She was born in the workshops of Pearl Harbor among cranes and hammers, under tropical heat and impossible deadlines. It was embodied in steel by 1,400 civilians and taken to the field by a crew who did not know if they would return. And it worked, not because she was pretty, but because she was ready. Japan, bound by its doctrine of honor and control, could not conceive that the enemy would fight anything that was not complete. This doctrinal rigidity prevented his admirals from seeing the obvious. War does not reward those who wait. It rewards those who act. And Midway was decided by those who acted with what they had, even if imperfect. The Yorktown was the antithesis of the Japanese ideal of a battleship. Dirty, cracked, patched. But he flew. He launched. He did. It operated as a living cog in American industry, stretching from the assembly line in Detroit to the emergency workshop in Pearl Harbor. Each Yorktown rivet was part of a larger system, an ecosystem of warfare that depended not on a single piece, but on thousands working together at a coordinated pace. This industrial vision was not new, but Midway was his first major demonstration in the field, and the impact was immediate. British military analysts, in reviewing the reports of the battle, identified the emergence of a new doctrine, that of warfare based on living logistics. It was no longer the toughest ship that won, but the one that could return to combat the fastest. It was no longer the most talented pilot, but the most trained squadron. It was no longer the most elegant attack, but the most frequent. In this new world, the beauty of the maneuver gave way to the volume of production. Accuracy was important, but cadence was decisive. Japan, still stuck in the artisanal model of naval excellence, was unable to adapt. Its shipyards produced with surgical slowness. His tactics demanded perfection in the smallest details. And like any system that does not admit failures, it only took one mistake for everything to fall apart. Midway was that mistake, and Yorktown was the instrument. In Japanese logic, that ship should not have existed anymore. But he existed, and by existing it proved that they were fighting against a doctrine they did not understand. Military historian Masatake Okumiya, an officer in the Imperial Navy and a war veteran, years later would write, "Midway showed us that the Americans were not interested in manuals but in results. We fought for honor. They, by repetition. They even mass-produced unpredictability. And that would become the hallmark of the American war, the ability to reorganize, to improvise, to adapt processes under pressure, and to multiply solutions, even under chaos." Midway was not just a victory. It was the first sample of a machine that was just beginning to move, a machine where civilian workers decided battles, where a damaged ship did not mean unusable, where urgency was transformed into doctrine. And that machine, still in its infancy in June 1942, would soon turn to something bigger, more ambitious and more devastating. All-out war on two oceans. In the next chapter, we will cross the Pacific and look to the Atlantic. Because while Japan was processing its loss, Germany was beginning to realize that its own calculation was also wrong, and that the same machine that resurrected Yorktown was preparing to smash the illusions of Nazi engineering. The history of Yorktown is more than a chapter of World War II. It is an emergency manual for any system that needs to choose between unattainable perfection and immediate functionality. In 1942, the United States did not win with the best ship. They won with the ship that was ready. It was not a victory of aesthetics but of urgency. Pearl Harbor's improvised engineering, applied under maximum pressure, validated a concept that would become central to American doctrine. When time is the enemy, speed is the weapon. This logic jumped from the war to the economy, from the assembly line to the decision-making offices. The ready now culture wasn't born in Silicon Valley. It was welded on the deck of a damaged aircraft carrier. This philosophical transposition spread in unexpected sectors. Companies began to incorporate the idea of MVP, minimum viable product, decades before the term existed. Teams are now trained to respond to failures with immediate solutions, and not with regrets or postponements. The Yorktown repair doctrine taught the West that the enemy does not wait, that perfection is often the camouflage of backwardness, and that the functional solution, even if imperfect, saves lives, changes games, defines stories. In the military field, this mentality was institutionalized. Combat engineering units began training with a focus on speed and improvisation. The culture of "fix it forward" was born from the experience lived at Midway. Officers were taught to decide with 70% of the information, because waiting 100% cost time, and time cost victory. This tactical elasticity spread, becoming an identity trait of the American military. But the deeper lesson may lie beyond military or corporate structures. It is in the way we face personal, social, or political crises, in how rigid systems collapse in the face of the unexpected, while flexible systems, no matter how ugly or patched they may seem, survive. Yorktown wasn't pretty, but it flew. It was not whole, but he attacked. It wasn't perfect, but the war changed. And perhaps this is the question that the present must ask the past. Are we trying to appear invincible or function despite the cracks? Because in 1942, America made a clear choice, and won. If today a society, company, or individual seeks to overcome unprecedented challenges, perhaps the answer lies not in creating the ideal plan, but in gathering the right people, trusting in the ability to adapt, and starting now. Time, as in Midway, does not wait. In the next and final chapter, we'll get down from strategy to the ground, back to the forgotten faces, to unregistered names, to the anonymous civilians who worked 72 hours straight to deliver a ship that should not exist. Because in the end, history is not made by concepts, but by hands dirty with grease, decisions made under pressure, and the silent courage of those who build while the world collapses. When the Japanese binoculars spotted the Yorktown at Midway, what they really saw wasn't a ship. It was the collapse of a doctrine. A miscalculation can be corrected with math, not an error of cultural understanding. Japan believed in war as ritual, where damage requires mourning and repair requires time. But Yorktown sailed against this reasoning. He wasn't just the third tactical piece in a battle. It was living proof that the United States had taken on another paradigm, that of war as urgency, of industry as a weapon, of engineering as a strategy. Japanese doctrine, based on honor and perfection, collapsed not because it was weak, but because it was inflexible. The enemy they faced was not only numerous, it was adaptable. Midway's lesson is clear and relentless. Logistics is not support. It is a strategic decision. Whoever notices the fastest strikes first. Those who improvise with precision master chaos. Whoever manufactures with scale changes the course of history. The American victory was won not only by admirals, but by steel soldiers, deck electricians, and workers without uniforms. Modern warfare belongs not to the strongest, but to the most flexible. As General Franz Halder wrote after Stalingrad, trying to understand the Nazi collapse, "We were defeated by trucks and by workers." If you value rigorous research and the truth behind the battles, please support our work with a like and your application. This helps keep forgotten stories alive. And we want to know, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Comment below as we're reading it all. And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact we're already investigating. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determine strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.